Richard is chair of the Joint Contracts Tribunal. He was chairman of Building Design Partnership, chairman of BE, which was a forerunner of Constructing Excellence, a vice president of the Royal Institute of British Architects, master of the Worshipful Company of Chartered Architects, and president of the British Council for Offices. He was awarded CBE in 2001 for services to British architecture and construction, and we're very happy to have him here today. So over to you.
Right, well, thank you, Leo. And good afternoon, everyone. This is normally known as the graveyard slot immediately after lunch because all your blood flow goes to your stomach, so you tend to drop off during. So I'll try and make it as interesting as I can in these circumstances. I'm an architect, but I've always been interested in technology and the way it can move us forward. But I'm interested in it for what it can do for the industry as a whole. No, yes, okay. The idea of using blockchain to improve the industry is basically yet another attempt to try and do something about what is a very dysfunctional industry. I'm going to suggest that it would be better not to try to improve today's construction industry, but to help transform the industry into the sort of thing it could be tomorrow. And the future model that I'm going to explore in particular is called servitisation, which I will explain. Okay, today's industry is essentially extremely weak. It is bought and sold entirely on the basis of price, which depresses margins, produces very low productivity and profitability, and it means there's no money for innovation through research and development. Relationships between buyers and sellers are entirely transactional. There are no long-term relationships except by exception. And we use forms of contract which are essentially adversarial, bouncing risk back and forth. And buildings don't really work very well either. Occupiers are usually incompetent at operating and maintaining them, even though they are liable for doing so. And there's a huge amount of waste. Everything goes through once, and most of the waste in Britain's landfills is construction waste. So that's a lot that's wrong. What sort of future might work better? The industry can be transformed in three ways. You can incrementally improve it, or you can evolve it into something more effective, or you can transform it by reinventing it. And there tends to be an assumption that one starts with improving, which is, as it were, minor changes to the way things are. And I think building information modeling, whilst it's radical, is an improvement rather than a transformation. Evolving means thinking about a fundamentally different way of doing it, but within the known context. And off-site fabrication, digital design for manufacture and assembly, and the idea of the digital twin are ideas going further, sometimes quite difficult ideas, but nevertheless ones which maintain pretty much the same model. And then transformation is the idea of wholly new ways of doing business. And it's that one that I'm going to explore with you because I think it's particularly suited to blockchain. And that idea is servitisation. And we have a picture of a jet engine because that is one of the most well-known examples of servitisation. Engine makers don't sell their engines to aircraft makers, they lease them. And the aircraft maker and the airline buy power by the hour. They buy reliable delivery for a rental, and which includes all maintenance. And it transformed the industry. Instead of competing on a capital price, the makers of engines now compete on whole life cost and reliability. And the engines have improved enormously as a result. We used to have 4 engines to get across the Atlantic. Now we only use 2 because they're both going to be still working by the time you get there. And everybody makes more money. It's all more reliable, safer, and the buyers conserve their capital. They don't actually shell out to buy the equipment in the first place. Now, in the built environment, oh yes, the digital twin really is the key to servitisation, because the supplier needs to be fully on top of how the machine is working whilst it's working, and to be able to maintain it remotely if possible, if it's one of the high-end digital twins. And this is one of the things that enables the arrival of servitisation. So demand pull. Built environment occupiers are essentially trying to have more flexibility and less responsibility for their occupation of a building. Instead of taking out a 25-year full repairing lease, which is the classic arrangement for landlord and tenant in the UK, more and more people are taking serviced offices. More and more people are renting housing built for that purpose, which essentially gives them no responsibilities for running the building. And the government, the biggest client of all, is seeking to move from taking on buildings which it owns and looks after to the delivery of outcomes through public buildings, not outputs, something much more sophisticated. At the other side of the coin, suppliers are actually keen to move from selling to leasing. Not all suppliers, but a number of pioneers. And what they offer is to finance, design, install and maintain. And usually this is where a product is radical. It's not easy to sell because it's not easy to demonstrate the return. And 1 or 2 examples are the arrival of LED lighting, which has transformed the business, and Philips, which is now called Signify, offer to provide you with light, not lighting. You rent what you use, they maintain it and monitor it down the line, and they replace parts and recapture anything that they replace. Siemens will offer you building automation systems as a service. Arizona Power and Light, which is where I have a second home, will provide you with a PV roof free, and they reckon it'll cost you less than if you continued on a classic basis. And you can rent, fit out and equipment for your building anyway. You always have been able to. So it's mainly about engineering services, which represent maybe 30 to 40% of the cost of the more sophisticated buildings. And there's a huge number of these services, and they're getting more all the time. But what's common to them is that they can be brought together as technologies that could be supplied on a rental basis, with maintenance put in there, provided they were digital twins with full feedback from how they're working. Their operation and maintenance represents about 80% of the cost of occupying a building. And of course, they don't last as long as the building. They're usually gone within 25 years. Digitally enabled maintenance, where you do what needs doing, not what it says in the maintenance book. You just do what the sensors are telling you needs doing, is much more efficient and prolongs life and cuts costs. And of course, if you're leasing something, then you still own it. So you can recapture worn parts and replaced elements to create a more circular relationship. But the main thing is that instead of competing on capital cost, you compete on service quality and delivery reliability, and you get monthly cash flow, not lump sums. So instead of feast and drought, it's continuous cash flow, which is a much better business model. And I'm looking at 3 typical scenarios that might emerge. The services element of a building might be, which is maybe a third of the cost of the building at the front end, might be bundled together to be delivered in a new building as a service. So the client gets their new building for 2/3 of the cost, capital cost they were used to paying, and they pay for the rest of it through the operating expense. And they have service level agreements so that everything is paid for as it is delivered, potentially part of a facility management contract against performance standards. And I'm sure you can see how blockchain would be a very handy way of organizing and paying for that. The second scenario is retrofit. We are going to be refitting almost every building in the next 20 or 30 years, and we'll be retrofitting it to try and achieve zero carbon performance. That's largely going to be about services engineering. Capital may be hard to find for it, so the idea of delivering built environment as a service may be the best way to get this done. And thirdly, whole buildings as a service. Build to rent, which is rising fast as a share of residential development, is essentially providing the occupier with something entirely on a rental basis, including furniture and appliances. But the original developer of it is conventionally paying for the capital cost. That could move to being as a service right through the industry, where all the elements are leased to the developer, who becomes an integrator, passes on that bundle to the occupier. That would leave finance used only for land, fees and fabric. All the other finance would be in the supplier's pockets, providing these technologies and operating them successfully. And I just want to finish by pointing up how important blockchain might be to making this sort of thing work. Because most of these payments involved would be automatic. We have lots of separate systems which have to be integrated, so there's a lot of automation likely to happen. So the question of, was a target hit, in which case payment is triggered, doesn't need human intervention. The building operates under digital control, calling up the supplier, whatever it needs. And the occupiers are paying for performance as it is delivered. And compared to PFI, which is 25 to 30 years old now, which failed because it was not in any way integrated or automated. And it was commercially naive on both sides, but it was exploitative of the occupier rather than supportive. One can imagine a new era where financed, designed, built and operated facilities become blockchain assisted and much more reliable, trustworthy, and the industry finally begins to have a relationship with its occupiers, which it can be successful with, and which occupiers will trust. There's a PFI hospital on the screen there, which is one of the last examples, and it was okay, but it will be wonderful to see a new generation of service-driven building, ways of building, which might well be enabled by blockchain. So that's my presentation, and I'll be happy to answer questions when we get to the discussion period. Thank you.